A freezing winter night in Chicago, the wind howled through the dark alleys of the South Side. Zion Carter, 22, walked briskly along the sidewalk after a long shift at the fast food restaurant. His fingers were numb from the cold, his worn-out shoes crunching over the thin layer of snow covering the pavement. He was only a few blocks from home when suddenly the wail of sirens shattered the silence. Before he could process what was happening, flashing police lights flooded the street. A patrol car sped toward him, tires screeching as it braked hard right in front of him. "Freeze, hands up." Zion frowned, his body tensing. What had he done wrong? Before he could speak, two officers burst out of the car, guns aimed directly at him. One of them, a tall man with a cold expression, stepped forward aggressively. "You match the description of a suspect in an armed robbery. Drop whatever's in your pockets now." Zion was stunned. Robbery? He was just a regular worker trying to get home. "I don't know what you're talking about." Zion took a step back instinctively, but before he could react further, a hard blow struck his back. He was slammed face first into the icy pavement, the cold seeping into his skin. His breath hitched as an officer pressed a knee into his back, wrenching his hands behind him and snapping the cuffs on with a painful force. "Don't resist," the officer barked, as if Zion was some dangerous criminal. From the dimly lit windows of the surrounding apartment buildings, curious eyes watched, but no one said anything. No one stepped in. Zion was shoved into the back of the police car, his mind spinning. He kept demanding an explanation, but the officers only smirked, offering nothing but silence. As the heavy door of the jail cell slammed shut behind him, his nightmare truly began. A dimly lit room, reeking of sweat, mold, and despair. Other inmates eyed him with suspicion, some growling as he passed. "Look at that. Fresh meat." A raspy voice came from the corner of the cell. A hulking man with rippling muscles sneered at him. Zion wasn't weak, but standing among men hardened by life behind bars, he couldn't hide his fear. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was innocent. But no one cared. That entire night, Zion sat curled up in the corner of the cell, knees pulled tightly to his chest, struggling to stay alert. The screams, the insults, the crazed laughter, it all echoed through the darkness. At that moment, Zion understood one thing: justice had no place within these walls. The next morning, Zion was dragged out of his cell and escorted to a small, cold interrogation room. Across the metal table sat Daniel Mercer, the prosecutor, a man in his 40s with neatly combed hair and an expensive tie. "We have all the evidence we need to convict you." A surge of anger flared inside Zion. "What evidence?" Mercer tossed a folder onto the table. Inside, a blurry surveillance video showing a masked figure running from the scene. A witness statement claiming to have seen Zion nearby. Zion's fingerprints on a wallet found near the crime scene. Zion stared at the documents, his heart pounding. "This is a mistake. I didn't do anything," he protested. Mercer smirked. "You have two choices: plead guilty and take a reduced sentence, or gamble on a trial. But with the jury looking at a young black man like you, I'd say the second option isn't a smart bet." At that moment, the door burst open. His mother, Lorraine Carter, rushed in. "My son is innocent. I want the best lawyer for him," she shouted, her eyes swollen from crying all night. Mercer let out a sigh. "Do you have the money to hire a private attorney?" Laurent's silence was her answer. Zion clenched his fists. The system wasn't built for the poor. When Zion stepped into the courtroom for the first time, he felt as if he had already been convicted before the judge even struck the gavel. Judge Jonathan Reyes, a well-known hardliner, peered down at Zion with a look of disdain, as if he were nothing more than a worthless criminal. "Another street kid who thinks he can beat the law," the judge scoffed. Zion could feel the mocking gazes from Prosecutor Mercer, from the testifying officer, even from the jury. They had decided his fate the moment he walked into the courtroom. His public defender was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, someone who had only received his case that morning. "I advise you to take the plea deal. "We can't win this," she whispered. Zion clenched his fists. Why did everyone already see him as guilty? After the first hearing, Zion was dragged back to the jail. His mother sobbed in the hallway, helpless except for her prayers. He had lost everything. His freedom, his dignity, his hope. Sitting in his cell, staring at the dim light flickering on the ceiling, Zion knew one thing. If he didn't fight back, the system would crush him forever. But could a young man with no power, no money, and no skilled lawyer stand against this entire system? He didn't know. But he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let them decide his fate without a fight. Inside the Chicago County Jail, Zion Carter felt like he was slowly losing his humanity. No sunlight, no fresh air. Only cold walls, chaotic screams, and the constant weight of fear pressing down on him. Time crawled at a painfully slow pace, each day stretching into what felt like eternity. Zion was locked up with real criminals, men who had long since lost any hope. He had no one to trust, no one to rely on. Each morning he was forced to eat tasteless food, cold, unappetizing meals of rice and watery soup, a constant reminder that he was no longer a person, just another number in the prison system. The other inmates began to take notice of him. They saw a young man, no gang affiliations, no protection, no one watching his back. A lone sheep among wolves. "How long do you think you'll last in here, kid?" one of them sneered, his scarred face twisted into a grin. Zion didn't respond, but he knew the man was right. If he didn't do something, he would be swallowed whole by this system. A night, as Zion lay on his cold steel bed, a shadow silently approached him. "Listen, kid," a rough voice spoke. Zion opened his eyes to see Bailey, a longtime inmate standing next to his bed. "I know you're innocent, but that doesn't matter in here. If you don't stand up for yourself, they will crush you." Zion didn't fully understand what he meant until a few days later when he got his answer. One morning, as Zion stood in line for his food ration, a punch came out of nowhere, slamming straight into his stomach. Bam! He collapsed, feeling as if the air had been completely knocked out of his lungs. "You think you're better than us?" A prisoner glared at him, his voice cold. Zion tried to get up, but as soon as he pushed himself up, another brutal kick struck him in the ribs. "You're our little plaything, got that?" Zion wanted to fight back, but his body was too weak. The pain consumed him, and humiliation weighed down on his spirit. No one helped. No one cared. A week later, Zion was allowed a family visit. When he stepped into the visitation room, his heart clenched at the sight of his mother, Lorraine Carter, sitting there. She looked thinner. The strands of gray in her hair were more visible now, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights. "My son," Lorraine whispered, as she took in the bruises on Zion's face. He couldn't bear to see his mother suffering like this. "I won't let them destroy you." Her voice trembled, but within it was an unshakable determination. "I've spoken to a better lawyer, but you have to fight for yourself, Zion. If you give up, they will bury you forever." Those words echoed in his mind. If he gave up, what would happen to his mother? After seeing her, Zion was no longer just a boy who accepted his fate. He started paying attention. He recalled everything his mother had taught him about the law. And he realized Prosecutor Mercer had no real evidence. The police had violated proper arrest procedures. The witness statement was full of contradictions. He needed a plan. If no one would fight for him, he would fight for himself. Zion sought out Bailey, the inmate who had warned him before. "I need a law book," Zion said firmly. Bailey narrowed his eyes at him. "What the hell are you up to?" "I'm going to save myself." Bailey scoffed, but then nodded. "You've got guts, kid." A few days later, Zion got his hands on an old, worn-out law book, but it still had enough information. He started reading, learning. He wrote down every inconsistency in his case, preparing himself for battle. When the official trial began, Zion walked into the courtroom with a different attitude. He was no longer the frightened boy being crushed by the system. He stood tall, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "I would like to make a statement before the court," he declared to the judge. The room fell silent. Everyone was caught off guard. Prosecutor Mercer smirked with disdain. "You think you're a lawyer now." But Zion didn't care. He began exposing every flaw in the case against him. The evidence lacked legal grounds. The witness testimony contradicted the security footage. The police had arrested him without reading his Miranda rights, which was unlawful. The courtroom gradually fell into silence. His mother Lorraine had tears in her eyes as she watched her son stand up and fight. Even Judge Jonathan Reyes, who had once dismissed him, began to reconsider. The battle was far from over. But for the first time in his life, Zion felt like he had a real chance to win. He was no longer a victim. He was a fighter. The tension inside courtroom No. 5 of the Chicago County Courthouse was so thick that one could almost hear their own heartbeat. All eyes were on the young man standing at the center of the room. No lawyer, no legal team, only his determination and sharp mind. Zion Carter, 20 years old, accused of grand theft, possession of fabricated evidence, and resisting arrest. A heavy list of charges, but Zion knew this was more than just a trial. This was a battle to reclaim his dignity, his freedom, and most importantly, a battle to force the system to look at itself. The moment the courtroom doors swung open, Zion could feel the contemptuous gaze of prosecutor Robert Mercer. Mercer was a seasoned prosecutor who had built his career by breaking down defendants who lacked experience. He had handled hundreds of cases, but he had never encountered a young man daring enough to represent himself. Judge Jonathan Reyes, a stern-looking man in his 50s, tapped his gavel lightly. "Court is now in session." Zion stood tall, trying to steady his breath as Mercer began his opening argument. "Your Honor, this case is quite clear. The defendant, Zion Carter, was found at the scene of a car theft on the night of August 14th. A witness saw him near the vehicle. Was stolen. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel, and when officers attempted to detain him, he fled." Mercer paused for a moment before continuing, his tone smug. "There's no reason for debate. The charges are crystal clear." He glanced at Zion with a condescending smirk. But Zion didn't waver. He knew that the picture Mercer had just painted was full of holes, and today he would tear it apart. When it was his turn, Zion stepped forward, his sharp eyes locking on to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I have a simple question for you." His voice was low but firm. "Is a fingerprint enough to convict someone?" The room fell silent. Zanet placed his hands on the table, his gaze sweeping over each juror's face. "If a single fingerprint is absolute proof, then anyone who touched that car before me should also be guilty, right?" A few jury members exchanged glances, clearly rethinking the prosecution's claim. Zion pressed on, his voice filled with confidence. "Yes, my fingerprints were on the steering wheel, that's true, but I had been inside that car because—" He raised a stack of papers, a signed service agreement from the car's owner. "The owner of the vehicle hired me to check the engine that afternoon." A shock wave rippled through the courtroom. Mercer froze, while Judge Reyes tilted his head, visibly surprised. "Then why wasn't this information in the police report?" Reyes questioned. Zion took a deep breath, then turned his gaze back to Prosecutor Mercer. "That's exactly what I'd like to ask him." All eyes shifted to Mercer. The prosecutor fumbled through the documents on his desk, flipping pages quickly, but he couldn't find a single piece of evidence to refute what Zion had just revealed. Zion had just dismantled the prosecution's strongest argument. But he wasn't done yet. He turned to the arresting officer, Officer Derek Holden, who was seated in the witness stand. "Officer Holden, do you recall reading me my Miranda rights that night?" Zion asked. Holden frowned, avoiding Zion's gaze. I think I did." "You think so? Did you, or did you not?" Silence. Zion walked over to the defense table and picked up another file. "Your Honor, I would like to present evidence that Officer Holden arrested me without reading my Miranda rights, violating my constitutional rights." Another shockwave. Judge Reyes leaned forward, now clearly intrigued. Do you have proof? Zion nodded and held up an audio recording, taken directly from Officer Holden's own body cam. When he pressed play, the voice rang out loud and clear. Put your hands behind your back. You don't need to know any of your rights. The courtroom exploded in murmurs and gasps. Judge Reyes slammed his gavel. Order in the court. Zion turned to the jury, his voice unwavering. This is how the system treats people like me. No rights, no fairness. They didn't arrest me lawfully. They didn't investigate the truth. They just wanted a name to convict. Prosecutor Mercer was no longer smirking. He could feel the case slipping out of his grasp. Judge Reyes took a deep breath before turning to the jury. Has the jury reached a verdict? One juror stood up. We have, Your Honor. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. We find the defendant not guilty. Boom. The room erupted in murmurs and gasps. Lorraine Carter broke into sobs while Zion stood frozen, almost unable to believe what he had just heard. But then, he took a deep breath. He had won. Justice had been served, not by luck, but by his own resilience and intellect. But he knew. This was just the beginning. As Zion stepped out of the courthouse, a crowd of reporters swarmed around him. A journalist approached, microphone in hand. Yana, you defended yourself and won. What's next for you? Zion looked straight into the camera, smiling confidently. I'm going to become a lawyer. And I'm going to fight for people like me. The doors of the Chicago County Courthouse slammed shut behind Zion Carter as he walked down the long hallway, his breath still unsteady. He had just won a grueling legal battle, but he knew the real fight wasn't over yet. The trial had ended with a not guilty verdict, but Zion couldn't ignore the glaring truth. The police and the prosecutor had deliberately suppressed evidence, and if they had done it to him, how many others had suffered the same fate? He couldn't just let it go. After the trial, Zion met with his public defender, Lisa Thornton, who had witnessed him dismantle Prosecutor Mercer's case right before her eyes. Though she was stunned by Zion's sharp legal mind, Lisa remained cautious. Zion, you won. Don't dig any deeper. Do you realize Mercer could come after you for this? But Zion shook his head. This isn't just about me. If I don't speak up, who will? He turned his laptop screen around, showing a list of recent cases prosecuted by Mercer. Most of the defendants were black, many couldn't afford private attorneys, and most importantly, there were clear signs of misconduct in multiple investigations. I don't believe I'm the only one they set up. I need to find more evidence. Lisa sighed, knowing he wouldn't stop. Then we need someone inside the system, someone willing to tell the truth. And luckily they knew exactly who could help. 3 days later, Zion and Lisa arranged a secret meeting in the shadows of an underground parking lot. Their contact, Elliot Sanderson, a young police officer who had once worked alongside Officer Derek Holden, the same cop who had unlawfully arrested Zion. Elliot looked nervous, his eyes filled with hesitation. I shouldn't be here, he muttered under his breath. If they find out I'm talking to you, I'll lose my job. Zion held his gaze, his voice calm, yet piercing. You've seen what they do, we just want the truth. If you stay silent, how many more people will be wrongfully convicted? Elliot clenched his jaw, breathing deeply as if battling himself. Finally, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a USB drive, his expression grim. This is internal police data. You're going to want to see it. Zion and Lisa exchanged stunned glances. They were holding evidence that could shake the entire system to its core. Back at Lisa's small apartment, they plugged in the USB and opened the files. What they saw left them speechless. Inside were dozens of audio recordings and internal messages between police officers and prosecutors discussing how to manipulate evidence, frame defendants who couldn't defend themselves, and fabricate testimonies. Then an audio file played. That kid doesn't stand a chance against us. As long as we write the report the right way, the jury will eat it up. How many times have we done this before? Don't worry, Mercer will handle the rest in court. Lisa shuddered as the words played through the speakers. My God, Zion, this isn't just a single case of misconduct. This is an entire operation. Zion clenched his fists. They had the evidence to take down the entire corrupt system. But that also meant they had become targets. Lisa, Zion said, his voice serious, we can't stay silent, but we have to do this the right way. Lisa nodded. We're not just going public. We're taking this to the federal level. They crafted the perfect plan. Back up the data, ensuring that even if something happened to them, the truth would still come out. Send the documents to the Department of Justice and major media outlets, making sure neither Mercer nor the police could bury the case. Meet with a high-profile investigative journalist, someone who could expose the truth without distortion. 2 days later, the press received the files. The media exploded. Shocking evidence. Percocet or Mercy fabricated. Multiple cases. Chicago police accused of manufacturing evidence. Hundreds of cases under review. The police department and the prosecutor's office descended into chaos. High-ranking officials were suspended, cases were reopened, and Mercer became the center of a criminal investigation. But Zion wasn't naive. The system wouldn't let him go unchallenged. 1 week later, Zion noticed he was being watched. A black unmarked car circled his house. Then a text message appeared on his phone. You think you can take us down? Stop now or you'll disappear. But Zion only smirked. He knew he was doing the right thing. There was no turning back now. He turned to Lisa. We can't let them intimidate us. Lisa looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. Then let's finish this, once and for all. 2 weeks later, the FBI arrested Prosecutor Mercer and dozens of officers involved in the corruption scheme. But what was the price of truth? Zion lost his peace. He became a high-profile figure, but also a thorn in the side of the old system. Yet he knew he had sparked real change. And this was just the beginning. Standing on the rooftop, gazing out at the Chicago skyline, his heart burned with resolve. This battle wasn't over. But now, he was ready for whatever came next. The atmosphere inside the Chicago federal courtroom was suffocating, so heavy that it felt as if everyone could hear the pounding of their own hearts. Zion Carter sat in the front row, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. This was the final day of the most important legal battle of his life. On the other side of the courtroom stood Prosecutor Mercer, the man who had manipulated an entire system, the man who had tried to throw Zion into prison for a crime he didn't commit. Now Mercer stood before the jury, waiting to hear his final judgment. Would justice prevail? Or would the system protect itself once again? The murmurs in the courtroom gradually faded as Judge Eleanor Warren entered, her sharp gaze sweeping across the room. This court is now in session for the final trial of Prosecutor Mitchell Mercer, charged with abuse of power, fabrication of evidence, and obstruction of justice. All eyes turned to Mercer. He was no longer the confident, smug prosecutor he had been in previous trials. His face was pale, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his eyes filled with fear. Zion swallowed hard. He had once been in that very same position, in a rigged trial, when the entire system had turned against him. But today the roles had reversed. Mercer's lawyer stood, taking a deep breath as he tried to maintain his composure. Your Honor, my client, Prosecutor Mercer, was simply following standard legal procedures. He never intentionally framed anyone. Zion almost laughed out loud. Not intentional? Were the internal police recordings, the messages discussing how to manipulate evidence, and the list of dozens of innocent people he had thrown in jail not enough to prove the truth? Lisa Torden, Zion's attorney, slowly rose from her seat. Your Honor, justice cannot be twisted by empty defenses. Prosecutor Mercer didn't just make mistakes. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he kept doing it because he believed no one would ever stand against him. She turned to Mercer, staring him down. But he was wrong. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Zion clenched his fists, his heartbeat pounding in his chest. Everything now depended on the jury's verdict. Time felt frozen as the jury foreman stood, holding a sheet of paper with their final decision. The jury has reached a verdict. Zion felt his entire body tense. He had fought so hard to get to this moment. From an innocent man crushed by a broken system, to the one who exposed an entire web of corruption. Now, the moment of truth had arrived. The room held its breath, all eyes fixed on the jury foreman. On the charge of abuse of power, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of fabrication of evidence, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Jurors, tears of relief, tight embraces. Zion felt his heart explode with emotion. He had done it. For the first time in years, justice had sided with what was right. Mercer stood there, frozen in shock. "No, this can't be happening," he whispered. "The system will protect me. I'm a prosecutor." But this time, the system no longer protected him. Judge Warren slammed her gavel down, her eyes cold and unwavering. "Mitchell Mercer, this court sentences you to 25 years in prison, no parole." Guards rushed forward, locking the cuffs around Mercer's wrists. He thrashed wildly, desperate, but no one cared. He had once wielded the power to destroy lives, but now he was the one being destroyed. Zion watched him being dragged away, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just relief. It was over. Less than a week later, the fallout continued. Dozens of wrongful convictions were overturned. The Chicago Police Department was forced to undergo a massive reform. Multiple prosecutors were fired or placed under investigation. The system had changed. And it all started with a 19-year-old kid who refused to accept injustice. That day, Zion stood on the rooftop of a building, looking down at the city of Chicago. The wind was cool and crisp, but his heart felt lighter than the breeze itself. Lisa stepped up beside him. "You did what no one else in this city dared to do." Zion smiled, but there was no pride in his eyes, only determination.
"We're just getting started." Lisa looked at him and nodded. "So, what's next?" Zion didn't even have to think. "I'm going to law school." He turned to her, his gaze steady and resolute. "And I won't just help one person, I'm going to change the entire system." After everything, Zion was no longer just another nameless young man caught in a corrupt system. He was the one who brought down one of the city's most dangerous abusers of power. He had turned justice from a distant ideal into a reality. But was this the end? Or just the beginning of something even bigger? As Zion stepped out of the courthouse, he took a deep breath. Raindrops drizzled onto his coat, but he hardly noticed. He had just climbed into his car when his phone rang. Unknown. He hesitated for a moment, then answered. The voice was rough, low, exhausted, but carried a sense of urgency. "Who is this?" Zion frowned. "It's me, Daniel Ruiz." Zion's heart stopped for a beat. Daniel Ruiz, the cop who had provided false testimony against him, a man who had been part of the system that tried to crush him. Zion's voice turned cold as steel. "Why are you calling me? I need to see you." Immediately, Zion narrowed his eyes. He didn't trust anyone easily anymore. But one thing he did know, if someone like Ruiz was reaching out, it had to mean something. He glanced at the clock. 9:47 p.m. His instincts told him this wasn't over. Zion walked into a small cafe on the corner of the street, the place Ruiz had chosen for their meeting. The cop looked different from the last time Zion had seen him. Thinner, exhausted, eyes filled with unease. Zion pulled out a chair, arms crossed over his chest. "Talk? If this is a trap, I promise you'll regret it." Ruiz shook his head, then placed a thick folder on the table. "I've stayed silent for too long." Ruiz took a deep breath. "I've seen too much to ignore it any longer." Zion didn't respond, but his eyes remained locked on the thick folder in front of him. Ruiz slid it across the table. MRSA was just the tip of the iceberg. Zion opened the file and immediately felt his breath catch in his throat. Fabricated evidence, dozens of other wrongful convictions, rigged trials, new names, and worst of all, they were still in the system. Zion felt a surge of fury rise in his chest. He had thought it was over, but it wasn't. The system hadn't collapsed completely. There were still more corrupt officials, still innocent people buried under false convictions. Zion lifted his gaze from the documents, staring straight at Ruiz. "Why are you speaking up now?" Ruiz let out a bitter laugh. "Because I was afraid. But when I saw you fight back, I realized I couldn't keep my head down forever." Zion took a deep breath, looking back at the files. He could walk away, or he could keep going. But the real question was, could he ignore this? The answer was clear. The next morning, Zion walked into Lisa's law office and placed the file on her desk. Lisa flipped through a few pages, her eyes widening as her breath grew heavy. My God, if what Ruiz says is true, then we've only taken down one snake in a den full of vipers. Zion nodded. "I can't walk away from this." Lisa studied him for a long moment before a slow smile spread across her face. "Then, are you ready to do this officially?" Zion frowned. "What do you mean?" Lisa leaned forward. "I have friends in the legal field, people who can help you, but only if you're truly ready to walk this path." Zion understood immediately. Law school, a longer fight, a path that wasn't temporary anymore. Becoming a lawyer, not just to defend himself, but to defend those who had no voice. He looked down at the files, remembering every innocent person crushed by the system. Then he looked back up. "I'm ready." Lisa smiled. "Good, because the system has no idea what's coming for it." 1 year later, Zion stepped into a lecture hall at the University of Chicago Law School, standing at the podium as a guest speaker, delivering a speech on the importance of justice. The entire room sat in silence, listening intently, because he wasn't just speaking about theory. He was living proof that justice could be distorted, but it could also be won back. After the speech, a student approached him. "Mr. Carter, I have a friend who was also wrongfully convicted. Can you help?" Zion looked into the student's hopeful eyes. He had once been in their place. He smiled and nodded. "Tell me their story." The old battle was over, but a new journey had just begun. Lessons for today's society. Justice doesn't come naturally. It requires people brave enough to stand up and fight for it. The system isn't perfect, but it can change if enough people dare to question it. Any of us can be a victim, or we can be the ones who create change. The question is, what will you choose to do?